The candle in the dressing-room at Marchford burned late that night, and through the door, which was not quite shut, a woman's voice said, in the amused French-accented English that half of London found so charming, and the wife, Rupert, will she not make trouble for us this time? And the Duke of Marchford laughed, low and easy. The laugh of a man who has never once in his life been made to pay for anything, and said, Sabine forgives me by morning. She always does. It is the best thing about her. In the passage outside, standing with a candle of her own in a plain grey wrapper and her hair already down for the night, the Duchess of Marchford heard it, and did not move, and did not make a sound. At 6 the next morning the tide would be at the full at Weymouth, and the mail packet for Guernsey would slip her lines, and by the time the Duke of Marchford woke at 11 and rang, as he always rang, for the hothouse rose to be cut for his apology, his wife would be 40 miles out and going, with the whole grey shine of the Channel between them. If you have ever been the person who forgives over and over, and heard your own kindness spoken of as a convenience, then you know exactly what she felt in that passage, and you will want to see what she did with it. Press subscribe now, because the last hour of this story is the best thing I have told all year. Leave a like if you believe forgiveness is a gift and not a hinge. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching from, and this. 6 times she had forgiven him. Would you have gone up those stairs and forgiven a 7th, or gone and looked at the tide table? Because the Duke of Marchford had made exactly one calculation about his wife in 6 years of marriage, and it was that she would always be there in the morning. And he was about to discover that a woman raised on a rock in the middle of the sea knows better than anybody alive that the tide does not wait for a man's convenience. Her name before it was Marchford was Sabine de Sausmarez, and she was born in a white house above St. Peter Port on the island of Guernsey, which is a place of granite and gorse and enormous weather, where the sea is not scenery but employment, and everybody knows what everybody's grandfather did in the last war. Her father, Philippe de Sausmarez, was a surveyor to the Admiralty, one of the men who spent 30 years in open boats with a lead line and a theodolite, making the charts by which the Channel is still sailed. And having no son to take out with him, he took his daughter. Sabine could box a compass at 6. At 9 she could take a bearing and lay it off on paper without help. At 12, on the deck of a hired cutter with the spray coming over, she corrected her father's assistant on the set of the tide through the Little Russell, and was right, and Philippe de Sausmarez laughed until he had to sit down on the combing, and told the story for the rest of his life. She grew up in the chart room of that White House, and learned there the 3 things that would eventually undo a duke. She learned the sea, which cannot be argued with. She learned that a chart is only worth the honesty of the man who made it, and she learned, from watching her father check every sounding twice, that the world is full of people who will accept a comfortable statement rather than take a measurement, and that these people are always, in the end, the ones who go on the rocks. Her mother died when she was 15, and her father when she was 21, and he left her, being a careful man. Everything he had, which was the White House above the town, 3 fields, 2 shares in a Guernsey brig, and a small stone property at the water's edge that had come down through her mother's people since anybody could remember. He left it to her, and here is the fact that would matter 6 years later, and that not one Englishman in 1,000 knew. Because Guernsey is not England, and never has been. It is what remains of the Duchy of Normandy. It keeps its own ancient law, and under that law the property a woman brings out of her own family stays hers, held in her own right, not her husband's. And no English deed, English agent, or English duke has the smallest power over one stone of it. Sabine knew that the way she knew the tide. Nobody ever asked her. She met Rupert Astley, Duke of Marchford, the summer she was 22, when he came to the island with a yachting party and got himself caught out by weather in the Great Russell, and was brought in by a fishing boat, wet, cheerful, and entirely undamaged, to the house of the late Admiralty Surveyor, where his host's daughter gave him tea and, when he asked her how the fisherman had known the way in, took down a chart, put her finger on it, and explained the whole thing to him in 4 minutes, tides, transits, and all. He was 26. He had never in his life met a woman who could do anything, and he fell in love with her the way a man falls in love with weather, suddenly, enormously, and without the slightest intention of changing anything about himself. They were married in the spring, in the parish church at St. Martin's, with half the island in the lanes outside, and the English relations came over in a chartered cutter and were charming and appalled in equal measure. What Rupert had actually married, though he never once put it to himself in those terms, was a coast. The Marchford estates lay along 30 miles of the Dorset shore, mismanaged since his grandfather's time by men who thought of the sea as the thing beyond the lawn, and into that arrangement came a woman who understood it as a working country with its own laws. Within 2 years the Duchess of Marchford had done 4 things that the tenants would still be talking about in 30. She had the harbour wall at Coombe Bay surveyed, and found the old wall was failing not from weather, but from a scour caused by the way a previous agent had built a slipway across the run of the tide, and she had the slipway taken out. She ended the wrecking, not by prosecuting anybody, which no magistrate on that coast had managed in 80 years, but by getting Trinity House to put a light on Vidler's Point and finding paid harbour work for the 2 families who had most depended on other people's misfortune. She wrote out, in her own hand, a set of tide and transit notes for the Marchford fishermen, and had 30 copies made, and there were boats along that shore using them 40 years later, and she buried a great many drowned strangers with a service and a stone, because the parish had been in the habit of burying them without either. That was her kingdom, and she was happy in it, or near enough, because the truth about Rupert Astley took a while to come out and came out gently, the way water comes into a boat with a sprung plank. He was not cruel. He was charming and generous, and completely without weight, a man made entirely of first impressions, and he had been forgiven by everybody in his life for everything he had ever done, starting with his mother, and he had drawn from that a general theory about the world, which was that things came right on their own. The first time was in the 2nd year, and it was a girl in a house in Bruton Street, and he confessed it himself, weeping, before she had the least suspicion, and the confession was so complete and so wretched that Sabine, 24 years old and in love, forgave him within the hour. In the morning he brought her a rose from the hothouse, cut and stripped of its thorns himself, and put it on her breakfast plate, and said, "You are an angel, Sabine. There is nobody like you in the world." And that, precisely that, is where the trouble began, because it was not a lie, and it was not manipulation, at least not at first. It was worse than either. It was a ritual, and a ritual is a thing that can be repeated. The second time was 11 months later, and there was a rose. The third was the following season, and there was a rose. By the fourth she had begun to notice that the apology had acquired a shape, that the words came in the same order, that even the weeping arrived at the same point in the speech, and that what her husband experienced during it was not shame, but relief, arriving on schedule, the way the tide arrives. And on the morning after the fourth, having put the rose in water because she could not bring herself to throw it away, Sabine went up to her writing table, took out the little red almanac in which she kept the parish accounts and the dates of the neap tides, and wrote in the margin of that day's page a single small letter F. She did it without any plan at all. She simply had a lifetime's training in recording things that had actually happened, and there was nobody in England she could have said it aloud to. There were 6 of those marks in that almanac by the 6th year. 6 little penciled letters scattered across the tide tables, and beside 2 of them she had, without meaning anything by it, noted the woman's name. She never spoke of it, not to Mrs. Gale, the housekeeper, who guessed, nor to Jean, her maid, who had come from the island at 17 and would have gone into the sea for her, and certainly not to her sister-in-law, Lady Sophia Astley, who would have said kindly that all men were like that. The parish knew nothing. In the parish she was the Duchess who had built the wall and stopped the wrecking, and if she was quieter than she had been at 22, quietness in a great lady is generally taken for dignity. And Rupert, who was not observant, but who was not stupid either, understood at some level below, thought that he had married the one asset in his life that never required maintenance. And he stopped. In about the 4th year, even bothering to be careful, because the arithmetic of it had become plain to him, and he had never in his life been able to resist an easy arithmetic. Whatever it cost, Sabine paid it. Whatever he broke, Sabine mended by morning. It was, as he said later to a woman in a dressing-room with the door not quite shut, the best thing about her. Madame Klein Vaudrey came into it in the 6th year, and she was not like the others. The others had been girls, mostly, silly and frightened, and gone within a season. Klein Vaudrey was 34, the widow of a French privateer captain who had died rich and been buried at sea. And she had come to London after the peace with 2 trunks, a small, dark beauty that photographs would not have caught at all, and an air of having survived things the drawing-room she now decorated could not imagine. She spoke 4 languages and played piquet like a professional, and she took one look at Rupert Astley and saw not a lover but an instrument, and played him with the same unhurried competence. By the spring she was at Marchford, invited openly, on the pretext of a connection with Lady Sophia's husband's family, and this was the difference between her and the others, that she came into the house. She dined at the Duchess's table, she walked in the Duchess's garden, and she conducted, from the first week, a campaign of the sort that leaves no marks, all of it courteous, all of it delivered with a smile, all of it aimed at establishing before witnesses that the Duchess of Marchford was a good, dull, provincial creature from an island nobody could find on a map. She would say, at dinner, "Oh, but the Duchess is an angel, she forgives everything," and half the table would laugh without quite knowing why it was funny, and Sabine would pass the dish and say nothing. She asked her once, before 9 people, whether it was true that in Guernsey the women went out in the boats, and whether Sabine had ever gutted a fish, and Sabine said, "Yes, madame. Several 1001 learns a good deal about a creature from the inside of it." And there was a small startled silence, and then Klein laughed and said, charming, and moved on. And afterwards Mrs. Gale heard her say to the Duke in the passage that his wife had a tongue after all, and that she liked her the better for it, and it was said with such indulgence that it might as well have been a slap. The 6th mark went into the little red almanac in June. That was Klein, and it was different in every way from the 5 before it, because there was no confession. Sabine learned it from her own maid, who had it from a footman, that Madame Vaudrey's rooms in Half Moon Street were taken in the Duke's name. There were no tears and no speech, and when Sabine, quiet and level, put it to her husband in his business room, Rupert did not deny it. He was, if anything, faintly injured. He said that Klein was a woman of the world and understood these things, that it altered nothing between him and Sabine, that he was very fond of her, that she was not to be provincial about it, and then, seeing her face, he came around the desk and took her hands, and made the speech after all, and it was word for word the speech of the 2nd year, and at the end of it he said, "You are an angel, Sabine. There is nobody like you in the world." And in the morning there was a rose on her breakfast plate. She forgave him because she did not yet know how to do anything else, and because a habit of 6 years is a channel cut in rock. But something had gone out of the thing, and she knew it at the time, and what she felt when she looked at that rose was not love or even grief. It was a kind of tiredness so complete that it had a taste. She wrote the 6th F in the almanac and put it away and went down to Combe Bay to see about the wall. And then, in August, at the great dinner for the county, Rupert Astley did the thing that broke the mechanism, and he did it without the smallest awareness that he had done anything at all. He had the hothouse rose cut, the way he did on his mornings of apology, and Sabine, who had come down early and seen the gardener take it in, felt her chest go tight with a hope she was ashamed of. And at dinner, in front of 40 people, her husband turned and laid it beside the plate of Madame Klein Vaudrey, and said, "For a beautiful woman, from a grateful house." The table thought it delightful. Klein picked it up and turned it in her fingers and looked, for 1/2 second, straight down the table at the Duchess, and smiled. And Sabine de Sausmarez, sitting under the arms of a family she had married into at 22, understood with perfect chart-room clarity that the ritual which had cost her 6 years of her life had been, all along, nothing but a gesture the man used on women, and that it was not hers, and had never been hers, and that there was nothing left in that house that belonged to her at all. She was, from that evening, done what she was not yet was ready, and there is a great deal of water between the two. It began, as these things do, with a letter about something else. The Marchford fortune was not all land. The 2nd Duke had put money into a West India house in Bristol, and the family still held a quarter share in a small fleet, 6 vessels in the sugar and hide trades, managed by the Duke's shipping agent, Mr. Josiah Bellingham, a large, hearty man who came down twice a year, brought presents for the servants, and talked to the Duke about tonnage in a way that made his Grace feel nautical. Sabine had never interfered with the shipping. She read the reports because a woman who has grown up in a chart room reads a fleet's returns the way other people read a novel. In September she read that the brig Clest, 400 tons, had been lost with all her cargo, though happily not her crew, on the night of the 11th of July, having foundered in heavy weather 60 miles west of Ushant, on passage from Bristol, and that the insurance, Mr. Bellingham noted, had been settled promptly and in full. Sabine read that paragraph twice, and then went and got the weather. That was all. That was the whole beginning of it. She had 6 years of her own barometer readings in the back of the red almanac, kept out of habit because her father had kept them, and she had the Marchford fisherman. Who could tell you what any day of any summer had done? And what the 11th of July had done, all along that coast and out into the western approaches, was almost nothing. It had been a flat calm with fog. There had been no weather off Ushant on the 11th of July, and a 400-ton brig, well found and 2 years out of the yard, does not founder in a flat calm with fog. In October the second thing arrived, and it arrived by pure accident in a letter from her cousin Marie in St. Peter Port, 4 pages of island news, of which the relevant sentence was in the middle of the third. Marie's husband's brother had been in Cadiz in August and had seen there, refitting, a very handsome English-built brig, renamed Estrella. And he had gone aboard because he thought he recognized her lines, and he had because she had been built at Bideford, and he had helped survey her, and her name then was Clest. Sabine sat with that letter in the chart-room at Marchford for the better part of an hour, and what she did then was what her father would have done, which was to stop guessing and take a measurement. Over the next 6 weeks she obtained, through the Guernsey house that managed her own 2 shares, and a Lloyd's man in the city, to whom she wrote as S. de Sarsmares, 3 things. The Lloyd's register entries for all 6 vessels of the Marchford fleet over 4 years. The policies, or rather the particulars of them, which showed that on 3 of those 6 vessels the insured value had been raised, in each case within 4 months of the ship's loss, and that on 2 of them the cargo had been insured twice, in Bristol and in London, by different agents in slightly different names. And the muster roll of the Clest, from which it emerged that of a crew of 14 supposedly rescued in a flat calm 60 miles offshore, 11 had never come home to any English port at all. She knew what she was looking at. Anybody raised where she was raised would have known. It was as old as the sea, and every insurance office in Europe had a name for it, and the men who did it either got very rich or were hanged in chains at execution dock. And every policy, every declaration, every claim was made in the name of the managing owners, and the principal managing owner, whose name stood at the head of the fleet and whose signature Bellingham held a power of attorney to use, was Rupert Astley, Duke of Marchford. In November she took it to him. She chose her hour, and she left the tone of it entirely out, and she put in front of her husband a single sheet on which she had set out, in the clearest hand she possessed, 4 columns: ship, date of loss, date the insured value was raised, and reported weather. She said, "I am not accusing anybody. I am telling you that 3 of your 6 ships have been lost in circumstances that will not stand a question, that the Clest is at this moment refitting in Cadiz under another name, and that every one of those claims was made in your name and on your authority. I want you to write to Lloyd's yourself, today before anybody else does, and put the whole of it before them, because if you find it first, you are a man who has been robbed, and if they find it first, Rupert, you are a man in the dock." Her husband looked at the sheet for about as long as it takes to look at a picture. Then he laughed, not unkindly, and said, "My darling, you have been reading Bellingham's reports again. He said that Bellingham had managed the fleet for 11 years, that ships were lost every week of the year, that the fellow in Cadiz had plainly seen some other brig, and that she was not to worry herself. And then he said the sentence she would repeat in a much quieter room 5 months later to a gentleman from the Admiralty. "Leave the ships to men, Sabine. You have your wall." She did not raise it again. That is the moment the marriage ended, though nobody in that house noticed for another 5 months, and it ended not because of Klein Vaudry, but because of a sentence about ships, which tells you something true about the way things actually finish. Sabine walked out of the business room, went up to the chart room, and stood for a while looking at the 11-mile stretch of coast she had spent 6 years mending. Then she sat down and began to do properly, and alone, the thing she had asked him to do. She wrote first to Guernsey, and Guernsey answered, because Guernsey always answers its own. Within a month she had a statement, sworn before a jurat, from her cousin's brother-in-law who had gone aboard the Estrella at Cadiz, with a description of the brig's knees, her false keel, and a repair to her starboard cathead that he himself had surveyed at Bideford. She had, from a chandler in Bristol, a copy of the Clest's outfitting account, which showed that in the 6 weeks before her final voyage she had been stripped of every article of value that could be got out of a ship without anybody remarking on it. Her spare canvas, her best cable, her chronometer, and 2 of her boats. And she had, in January, from a broken-down ship's carpenter in a lodging-house in Bristol, whom the chandler's clerk had found for her, a statement he was frightened to sign, and signed anyway, that he had been paid £11, and a passage to Lisbon to bore and plug the Clest's garboard strake before she sailed, and that he had done the same office 2 years before on a bark called the Marchford Lass. It was in February, in the parlour of the Guernsey house in Bristol, where these papers were being kept for her, that she met Captain Elias Renouf. He was 41, a Guernsey man, master and part owner of 5 vessels, built like a capstan, with hands that had done every job on a ship and a plain black coat that had been good 8 years ago. He had been asking the same questions for 9 months, and had begun because his sister's boy, a lad of 19, had been rated able aboard the Marchford Lass, and had never come home, and had never been reported dead, and his mother was still, 2 years on, going down to the harbour when the Bristol packets came in. They put their papers on the same table that first afternoon, and did not get up for 5 hours. What Sabine noticed about him in the first 10 minutes and for the rest of her life was that he did not once look surprised. He did not marvel that a Duchess could read a Lloyd's Register. He asked her whether the barometer readings were her own and how they had been taken, and when she told him he grunted and said they would do, and moved on. And she understood that she had just been given a professional certificate by a man who did not know how to give any other kind of compliment. At the end of the afternoon he said, "Your Grace, I had best be plain with you, because we are going to be working together, and you will hear it from somebody else, if not from me. I am not a gentleman. My father sailed us smack out of St. Sampson, and I went aboard at 11. And I have owned my own bottom since I was 28. And 2 years ago the corporation put my name forward for a knighthood over a matter of a rescue, and I asked them not to proceed. Because a man who is knighted for pulling people out of the water spends the rest of his life being asked about it at dinner instead of working. I say this so you know exactly what is sitting at your table." Sabine, who had spent 6 years married to the 3rd oldest dukedom in England, said, "Captain Renouf, you are the most restful person I have met in a decade, and let us go back to the cargo manifests." They worked through the spring, in Bristol and by letter, and it was the first partnership of Sabine's adult life. He taught her how a scuttling is actually done, which is not romantic, and how the money moves afterwards, and she taught him how to lay a case out on paper so that a man in a wig could follow it without going to sea himself. And somewhere in that spring, without either of them saying one word about it, because she was another man's wife and both of them were the sort of people who do not pretend not to know a thing like that, it stopped being only a case. She noticed that she dressed with more attention on the days she went to Bristol. He noticed that he had begun to save up small facts about tides to tell her. Neither of them mentioned it, and both of them understood it perfectly, and it sat in the room with them for 4 months like a stove that nobody would admit was lit. The last piece came in April, and it came from Renouf, who had gone to Cadiz himself in March, seen the Estrella, and come back with a copy of her bill of sale. The vendor was a house in Antwerp. The master who had brought her in, and who now commanded her, was a Frenchman named Hippolyte Vaudry. And Hippolyte Vaudry was the younger brother of a privateer captain who had died rich and been buried at sea, and whose widow had been living for 11 months in rooms in Half Moon Street, taken in the name of the Duke of Marchford. Sabine read the bill of sale twice and put it down, and laughed once, with no pleasure in it. It was all one thing, and had been from the beginning, and she had been looking at 2 halves of it for a year without joining them. Bellingham managed the fleet, raised the insured values, and provided the papers. Vaudry's brother took the ships and sold them where nobody would ask, and Klein, who was neither an ornament nor an accident, had been placed in the Duke's life to keep his eyes where they had been for 6 years, anywhere but on his own affairs, and to be in his house, at his table, in his correspondence, in case any of it needed steering. The mistress was not the crime. The mistress was the fog, and Rupert Astley, who believed himself the luckiest man in England, was not a partner in any of it. He was the name on the policies. Every claim of the last 4 years had been made on his authority under Bellingham's power of attorney. Every declaration was in his name. And if the whole business came out from the outside, by an inquiry or an informer, it would not be Bellingham standing in the dock at the Admiralty Sessions as principal. It would be the managing owner. It would be her husband, who could not tell a garboard strake from a garden gate, and who would go to it with his mouth open in astonishment, and who might very well hang. Sabine sat with that for a full day. This is the part people always ask about afterwards, and the honest answer is that she was never for one moment tempted to let it happen. She had stopped loving him somewhere around the 4th penciled letter in a tide table, and stopped respecting him in a business room in November, but she had watched drowned men brought up the beach at Coombe Bay, and there was nothing in her that could stand by and let even a fool be destroyed when she had the means to prevent it. What she understood, and what took her that whole day to see clearly, was that saving him and staying with him were 2 entirely separate acts, and that she had spent 6 years believing they were the same one. She would save him, and then she would go. And it was as if a lock had opened, because the moment she had it in that order, the rest of it arranged itself in an afternoon, the way a passage arranges itself once you have the tide. Then, in May, the other side moved, and moved at her, which is how she knew they had finally noticed her. Her Guernsey attorney wrote that a power of attorney had been presented in St. Peter Port, purporting to be executed by the Duchess of Marchford, and to authorise the sale of the South Mares house and the Water's Edge property, and that he had refused to act on it, and impounded it, and that in his opinion the signature was a tolerable forgery and the seal was not. On its face, it was an attempt at her land. In fact, as Reneuve saw at once, it was better than that and worse. The Water's Edge property had a stone quay and a lock-up store, and it was, though nobody in London would ever have thought about it, one of about 4 places on that coast where a vessel could be brought in quietly at night and things taken out of her. They did not want her house. They wanted her quay, and they had been prepared to forge her name to get it. The same week, Jeannie's brother, who crewed on a Marchford lugger, was told by the agent's man that his place was not certain, and the subscription money for the Combe Bay harbour wall, £311 raised over 4 years, was moved by Bellingham into the fleet account, on the Duke's authority, without a word to anybody. Sabine went to see Lady Sophia Astley the next morning and laid the whole of it in front of her. And Sophia, who was not a clever woman but was an Astley to her bones, went white and then went to her desk. She came back with the register of powers of attorney executed under the family's seal, in which every instrument of 11 years stood recorded, and the register showed plainly that no power had ever been given by the Duchess to anybody at all. "My brother," said Sophia, put her hand flat on the register and looked at her sister-in-law. "My brother is a fool, and I have been telling myself for 6 years that he is only a fool. What do you want me to do?" And Sabine said, "Keep this in your own hands until the last week of June, and say nothing to Rupert, and be ready to swear to it." And then, being who she was, she went home and got out the tide tables for June. She planned it as a passage, because that was the only way she knew how to plan anything. A passage has 3 parts: the departure, the run, and the landfall, and the mistake amateurs make is to think about the run. The landfall was easy, because it was home. The White House above St. Peter Port had been let to a doctor's family for 6 years. Their lease was out in June, and she told her agent not to relet it and to have the chart room aired. The run was a mail packet, and she had made it 30 times. The departure was the whole of the problem, and it had 2 conditions: that the case must be beyond recall before her husband knew anything, and that she must be off English soil before Bellingham did, because a man facing the Admiralty sessions is capable of a great deal, and she had a quay he wanted and a maid whose brother could be leaned on. So she worked backwards from the tide. The mail packet for Guernsey went out of Weymouth on the Thursday morning, on the flood, and on the 26th of June the flood made at 20 minutes past 5. Marchford was 11 miles from the packet quay by the coast road, an hour and a half in a light chaise, and Jeannie's brother had a lugger and 2 cousins, and would be alongside the steps at Vidler's Point at 3 in the morning if the road looked watched. In the last week of June, Sabine did 9 things, and did them in an order she had written out in her own hand and burned. She had 3 fair copies of the case bound, with an index, the sworn Guernsey statement, the carpenter's confession, the Cadiz bill of sale, the register abstracts, the doubled policies, the muster roll, the weather, the forged power of attorney, and Sophia's register. She wrote a covering letter to Mr. Tremaine at Lloyd's, one to Sir Charles Frayne at the Admiralty, and one to her attorney in Lincoln's Inn, and in each she set out plainly that the managing owner had been imposed upon by his agent, and put the evidence of it, and read that paragraph over 5 times to be sure it could not be misread. She executed a fresh instrument, revoking every authority ever given in her name. She paid the £311 of the Harbour Wall subscription back into the parish's own account out of her private money and got a receipt. She went down to Coombe Bay and walked the wall and sat an hour with old Mrs. Vidler, who had buried 2 sons out of that bay, and did not tell her anything. She wrote to Elias Renouf 4 lines, saying the packets would be posted on the Wednesday night, that she would be at St. Peter Port by Thursday evening, and that when the business was finished she would be glad to see him at her own house, and that she thought he would know what that meant, since he had never needed anything said twice. And she wrote a letter to her husband, which took her longer than all the rest of it together. And then, on the Wednesday evening, the 25th of June, Rupert Astley came home from London with Madame Klein Vaudrey and a party of 6 for the shooting, and after dinner, in front of all of them, he told the story of his wife's brilliance about the harbour wall, and of how she had explained the little Russell to him at 22, and he told them well, because he was fond of her, in the way a man is fond of a chair he has always sat in. And Klein said, "And I am told that in the islands they say the Duchess forgives like the tide, always coming back." And 1 or 2 people laughed, and Rupert laughed too. And at 11:30, Sabine went upstairs, and was crossing the passage in her wrapper with a candle when she heard, through the door of the dressing-room that was not quite shut, Klein Vaudrey ask, and the wife, Rupert, "Will she not make trouble for us this time?" "Sabine forgives me by morning. She always does. It is the best thing about her." She stood in the dark passage and found, rather to her own surprise, that she felt nothing at all. Not rage, not even the old tiredness. It was the feeling you get on the deck of a boat when a wind you have been waiting for comes in at last and settles, and everything you have been holding steady begins, quietly, to move. She went into her room. She woke Jean, who had been half expecting it for a fortnight, and did not ask a single question. The 2 trunks had been corded for 3 days. At midnight she carried 3 sealed packets down herself to Mrs. Gale, who had been in that house 30 years, and who took them and looked at her mistress once and said, "God bless you, your grace. I will put them in the mail at Dorchester myself at 7. And not before." At 1 o'clock she laid her letter on her husband's writing table in the business room, where he would find it in the morning when he came to ring for the Rose. At 20 minutes past 2, the chaise came round to the east door with the lamps out. And Sabine de Sausmarez, Duchess of Marchford, walked down the steps of that house for the last time, in a plain grey travelling dress, carrying her father's chart case under her arm, and did not look back at it, because she had planned the departure very carefully, and looking back at things was not in the plan. The packet sailed on the flood at 20 minutes past 5, with a light air from the northwest and the sun coming up out of a bank of haze over Portland. And the Duchess of Marchford stood at the weather rail with her hood back, and watched the English coast lie down behind her. 11 miles of it that she knew stone by stone. The light on Vidler's Point that she had argued Trinity House into building, the mended wall at Coombe Bay, and then the whole of it going blue and small and unimportant, and Jean, who had been crying quietly since Dorchester, stopped somewhere off St. Albans Head, and began instead to talk about her mother's house. They raised the islands before 6 that evening. Sabine had crossed that water perhaps 40 times in her life, and she had never once seen it the way she saw it that evening. The long grey back of Sark going gold at the top, the Casquettes away to the north, and then the whole of Guernsey opening out with the sun behind it, and the pilot boat coming down to meet them under the Great Russell, where she had once, at 12 years old and soaked to the skin, told a grown man he had the set of the tide wrong. She was home before dark. The doctor's family had left the chart room exactly as it was. Her father's second-best theodolite was still in its case in the window seat, and the house smelled of tar and beeswax and salt as it had not in 6 years. And she slept 11 hours, which she had not done since she was 22. At Marchford that same morning, the Duke of Marchford rang at 11, as he always rang, and asked for the rose to be cut, and was told that her Grace's rooms were empty and her Grace's trunks were gone. He did not believe it for the better part of an hour. He went up himself and looked into the chart room where the racks had been cleared, and her bedroom where the bed had not been slept in, and the morning room where 6 years of parish accounts stood in their ledgers, each balanced and ruled off and left for whoever came next. And then he found the letter in the business room, and he read it standing up, and Mrs. Gale, who was in the passage, said afterwards that she heard him say, aloud, to nobody. But I have not even apologized yet. The letter is worth setting down, because a good deal of what came afterwards turned on it. It was 4 pages, and there was not one word of reproach in it. It said, I am gone, and I am not coming back, and this is not a Minerve, so please do not send after me. It said, you will find in your business room a fair copy of everything that follows, and you must read all of it today, because by the time this is in your hands, the same papers are with Lloyd's and the Admiralty. And it laid the whole of it out, the ships, the raised values, the doubled policies, the Clest at Cadiz under the name Estrella, the Carpenter and the £11, Hippolyte Vaudrey, the forged power of attorney, and Bellingham. It said, I have put it before them in terms which make it plain that you were imposed upon, because I believe that to be true, and because I would not have any man hanged for being a fool, least of all one I once loved. If you had written to Lloyd's yourself in November, you would have been a man who found a fraud in his own house. As it is, you will be a man who was rescued from one, and that is a smaller thing, but it is not the dock, and it is what I could get for you. Do not let anybody persuade you to defend Bellingham. And it finished, I forgave you 6 times, and I marked each one, not out of spite, but because I was raised to write down what actually happened. You told Madame Vaudrey last night that I forgive you by morning. It was true. It has been true for 6 years, and I do not take it back now, because forgiveness given is not a thing a person can reach in and take out again. But forgiveness is a gift, Rupert, and you turned it into a hinge, and used it every time you wanted a door to swing. I am not angry. I am finished. The tide made at 5:20 this morning, and I went with it. Sabine, he sat in the business room until 3 in the afternoon. Then he did the only 2 intelligent things he ever did in the whole of this story, and he did them one after the other. He sent for his sister, who arrived within the hour with a register under her arm and a look on her face that he had never seen there before. And he took his wife's fair copy, and got into his own carriage, and drove to London through the night, and was at Lloyd's when it opened on the Friday morning, and asked for Mr. Tremaine, and said, I am the managing owner of the Marchford fleet. My wife has laid papers before you. Every word of them is true so far as I am able to judge, and I am here to answer any question in the world you care to put to me. Josiah Bellingham was arrested in Bristol on the Saturday. on a warrant sworn at the instance of the underwriters, with a valise in his hand and the Lisbon packet sailing time in his pocket. Madame Klein Vaudrey left Marchford on the Friday morning in a hired chaise, having spent Thursday evening discovering that a house is a cold place when the servants have decided about you. She was in London by Saturday and out of it by Tuesday, and the last anybody in England saw of her she was going aboard at Harwich for the Antwerp packet with the 2 trunks she had come with, 6 years older and no richer. And the end of her is a lodging-house on a canal in a city where the people who once found her charming were the people she could no longer afford to know. Her brother-in-law was taken at Cadiz in September at the request of the underwriters, and the Estrella, which had been the Clest, was sold for the insurers, and 11 men of a crew of 14 who had never come home were traced to a Portuguese port where they had been paid off and abandoned, and 9 of them came home, and Elias Renouf's sister's boy was one of them, and walked up the hill to his mother's door in St. Sampson on a Tuesday in November 2 years and 4 months after she had stopped expecting him. That is the part of this story Sabine cared about most, and the part she never once mentioned afterwards without having to stop and look out of the window. The Duke of Marchford came to Guernsey in the 3rd week of August. He came without notice in a chartered cutter and was set ashore at the Albert Steps in a good coat with a hothouse rose in a tin case, which was the most Rupert Astley thing that ever happened in his life. He walked up through the town, where a good many people knew who he was and nobody offered to carry his bag, and was received in the chart room by his wife, who was standing at her father's table with a survey pinned out in front of her, and who did not sit down or offer him a chair. He made his speech, and in fairness it was a better speech than the ones before it, because it had facts in it: Bellingham committed for trial, the underwriters satisfied, the Harbour Wall subscription made good twice over, Jean's brother given a lugger of his own. He said he had learned the whole business of the fleet in 8 weeks and sold the share. He said he had not seen Klein Vaudrey since the Thursday and never would, and that he understood now what he had done and had not understood it before, and that this was not an excuse, and Sabine thought it was the first time in 7 years she had heard him say a true thing that cost him something. And then he came to the end of it and said, "So I have come to ask you to come home, and I will wait as long as you like." And he held out the tin case with the rose in it. Sabine looked at it for a moment. Then she said no, and the whole of the rest of it followed from that one syllable, spoken in an ordinary voice in a room that smelled of tar and paper. She said, "I did forgive you by morning. That is the one thing about the last 6 years you have never once got right. It was not that I was too weak to be angry, or too provincial to know what was being done to me. I forgave you every time, freely, on purpose, and it was the most expensive thing I owned, and I spent all of it. And then I heard you tell a woman in a dressing-room that it was the best thing about me, and I understood what I had actually been for 6 years, which was not a wife. I was a mechanism. You would break a thing at night, and I would mend it by morning, and you slept perfectly well because you had a mechanism. Forgiveness you have, Rupert, all of it, and I do not take back 1 hour of it. But it is a gift, and you made it a hinge, and I am not a door. Return, never, he said, hoarsely. Is there another man? And she said, there is a man I intend to marry when I am free, and he has never once been in a room alone with me, and you may believe that or not as you like, but you will not use it. And then she told him the last thing which he had not seen coming. because it had never occurred to him to find out what the law was outside the county of Dorset. She said, "I have taken a house in Edinburgh, and I go there in October, and I shall live there the year that is required. And then I shall sue you in the court of session, where a wife may divorce a husband for adultery, and where the evidence will be your own tenancy in Half Moon Street, and the sworn word of the servants of your own house. You will not oppose it, because I have Sophia's register and the whole of the Marchford file, and because if you oppose it, every word of both goes into a Scottish court in open session with the newspapers present. Do not think of this as a threat. Think of it as a tide table. It is simply what is going to happen, and at what hour, and I am telling you so that you may arrange your affairs." And Rupert Astley, who had never once been told the exact truth by anybody in his employment or his family, stood in a chart room on an island in the middle of the sea and heard it from his wife, and had nothing whatever to say. He went down to the harbour. He left the rose on the table in the tin case, and Jean threw it into the sea off the pierhead that evening on her own initiative, and told nobody for 11 years. Josiah Bellingham was tried at the Admiralty Sessions in the spring on 3 counts of destroying a vessel with intent to defraud the underwriters, and the case against him was. The prosecuting counsel observed to a colleague afterwards the best prepared brief he had ever been handed by anybody who was not a king's counsel. The carpenter gave evidence and was not shaken. The weather was read out from a lady's private barometer register and admitted without objection. He escaped hanging by the width of a hair and the discretion of a merciful judge, and was transported for 14 years, and died in New South Wales without ever understanding, according to a letter written by a chaplain, that the thing which had actually destroyed him was that a duchess had once been taught by her father to check every sounding twice. Rupert Astley did not oppose the action in the Court of Session. The decree came in the spring of the 2nd year, and he paid the costs of it, which was the first time in his life he had ever paid for anything unpleasant without being asked twice. He never remarried. He sold the London house and lived at Marchford, and became, by very slow degrees, the sort of man his tenants stopped bracing themselves against. And the harbour wall at Coombe Bay was rebuilt to its full length in the 3rd year, 300 yards of it, out of his own income, under the direction of an engineer from Weymouth, working to a survey drawn 6 years earlier in a fine sloping hand. And when the parish wanted to put his name on it, he refused, and gave them her mother's instead, so that the wall is called the Salsmarers Wall to this day, and not one visitor in 1,000 knows why. Once a year, on the 26th of June, he wrote her a letter. They were not long, and they were never answered, and she kept every one of them in the drawer of her father's chart table, unopened after the 3rd. Because she had forgiven him and did not need to be reminded of it, and because an account that is closed is not reopened, but neither is it burned. Sabina de Sausmarez was married to Captain Elias Renouf at the parish church of St. Martin's in Guernsey 4 days after the decree, in the same church where she had been married the first time, and everybody on that end of the island came, and it rained enormously. And nobody minded. He asked her on the quay at St. Peter Port a fortnight before, having waited 2.5 years without once pressing her, and what he said was, "I have been in love with you since the afternoon of the barometer readings, and I have 5 ships and a house at St. Sampson with a bad roof. And you are a duchess and will not be one if you marry me. And I would like you to think about that seriously for a week before you answer." And Sabine said that she had been a duchess for 7 years and had found it a poor trade, and that she would not require the weak. They had 2 children. The chart room in the White House above the town became, in time, the best private collection of Channel surveys in either kingdom, and out of it, in the 5th year, grew the thing she is actually remembered for on that island. A school in a stone building by the water where the daughters of fishermen and pilots and shipwrights were taught, free, and paid a small wage while they learned. To read a chart, take a bearing, keep a set of accounts, and understand a policy of insurance. She taught the first 4 years of it herself. When the corporation asked her at the opening to say a few words about why the daughters and not the sons, she said that the sons already had the sea, and that what she wanted was that no woman on that island should ever again have to sit in a room while a man explained her own coast to her wrongly. Her daughters learned to swim before they learned to write, and when the elder of them, at 19, came home one evening from the mainland in a temper about a young man who had been faithless and was very sorry and had brought flowers, and asked her mother what she ought to do, the Duchess, who had stopped being a duchess, put down her pen and gave her the answer this family has repeated for 4 generations. Forgive him if you want to. Forgiveness is yours to give, and it costs him nothing to receive, so give it freely or not at all. But listen to what he says about it afterwards, my love, because a man who is grateful will speak of it as a debt, and a man who is not will speak of it as a habit, and the day you hear yourself described as a mechanism, you go and look at the tide table, because you are not the door in his house that swings whenever he leans on it. You are the sea, and the sea keeps its own hours, and it does not stay in harbour to be convenient to anybody.